What if the greatest empire in modern history wasn't built on diplomacy and civilization, but on blood, deception, and absolute control? The British Empire once ruled over a quarter of the Earth's surface. But behind the maps stained in red lies a story few dare to tell, a story of conquest masked as progress, of rebellion crushed in silence, and of lives forever changed under the weight of a foreign crown. In this video, you'll uncover how a small island nation rose to dominate vast continents and command hundreds of millions of people. We'll trace the real engine of British imperialism, from brutal wars and stolen wealth to the strategic manipulation of global power. It's a story that reshaped borders, rewrote cultures, and still echoes through our world today. You may think you know the British Empire, but history has a different version. One that starts not with glory, but with calculated ambition, and ends not with a fall, but with consequences still unfolding. This is the real story, and it begins right now. Imagine being a farmer in Bengal in 1770, watching your crops wither under scorching skies, only to be told by the British East India Company that you still owed taxes, in silver, not rice. As famine swept across the land, millions died. But the grain stores were locked. The company had its profits to protect. This wasn't an empire built with cooperation. It was carved into the bones of the forgotten. Or picture a Zulu warrior in the shadow of British rifles, defending his homeland not for gold or glory, but for dignity. From the highlands of Scotland to the plains of Africa, the human toll of empire was devastating. Entire cultures were broken, languages silenced, and identities reshaped, all in the name of civilization. Yet for the millions who lived under British rule, it often felt more like erasure than enlightenment. But it wasn't just suffering, there were those who fought back. From Gandhi's Saltmarsh to the Irish uprisings, resistance flared across the empire, defiant voices rising against an imperial machine. These weren't just footnotes in history. These were people, mothers, sons, warriors, and thinkers who shaped the course of resistance through blood, will, and sacrifice. The Seeds of Empire, 1497 to 1600. The story of the British Empire begins not with power, but with desperation. In 1497, the English crown, dwarfed by the maritime dominance of Spain and Portugal, sent an Italian navigator, John Cabot, to seek a route to Asia. What he found was not spices or silk, but the coastline of Newfoundland barren, cold, and rich in cod. It wasn't the grand discovery they hoped for, but it marked the first spark of English interest beyond its borders. Over the next century, England remained largely absent from global exploration, locked in internal strife and religious turbulence under the Tudors. But when Queen Elizabeth I took the throne in 1558, everything changed. She brought with her an ambition that would ripple through history. By the late 1500s, England's attention turned toward privateering state-sanctioned piracy. Men like Sir Francis Drake and Sir Walter Raleigh attacked Spanish ships and colonies with ruthless efficiency, bringing stolen silver back to London and undermining Spanish hegemony. These weren't just random raids, they were rehearsals for empire. In 1588, England's naval strength was tested and proven during the defeat of the Spanish Armada. Though outnumbered, the English fleet outmaneuvered the mighty Spanish force. The psychological victory ignited a new belief that a small island could defy a global superpower. The seeds of expansion were now sown not just in ambition, but in blood. In 1600, the British East India Company was formed, signaling a dramatic pivot. Unlike the chaotic piracy of the past, this was organized conquest masked as commerce. Granted sweeping powers by the crown, the company could wage war, mint money, and govern foreign territories. Its first target, India. But this was not a full invasion, it was infiltration. Through strategic trade deals and manipulation of local rulers, the company slowly embedded itself within the rich tapestry of South Asian politics. What began as commerce would evolve into colonization, and the first true imperial outpost was underway. Britain had found its method and its mission. Expansion through strategy and violence, 1600 to 1800. As the 17th century unfolded, the British Empire shifted from coastal outposts to territorial control. The East India Company became not just a merchant power, but a de facto government. Through ruthless manipulation, bribery, and military pressure, it played Indian princes against each other, exploiting fractures in the Mughal Empire. By 1757, the Battle of Plassey changed everything. With just over 3,000 troops, Robert Clive defeated an Indian army 10 times larger thanks not to superior force, but betrayal and bribes. In the aftermath, Bengal, one of the richest regions in the world, was under British control. It was a turning point. The British were no longer guests in India. They were rulers. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the empire was expanding in another direction. Settlers poured into North America, displacing indigenous peoples and establishing colonies from Virginia to Massachusetts. These colonies, while economically valuable, were often chaotic. Relations with Native American tribes were volatile, and internal governance was patchy. But tobacco, cotton, and sugar made the colonies indispensable. Slavery became the foundation of this economy. Millions of Africans were trafficked across the ocean in brutal conditions, their lives commodified for empire. The wealth extracted from their labor fueled the rise of British cities and the financial institutions that still exist today. The 18th century was marked by constant war. Britain fought France in a series of global conflicts. From the War of Spanish Succession to the 7 Years' War, these weren't just European struggles, they were battles for colonial dominance. In the Caribbean, Africa, and India, Britain clashed with France for control of ports, plantations, and people. Victories in these wars expanded British territory but came at a cost. The empire was overstretched, and resentment brewed in the American colonies. When the colonies revolted in 1776, it was a blow to imperial pride, but not to imperial ambition. Britain would soon redirect its attention elsewhere, to the vast, untapped lands of Australia and Africa. The Victorian apex and the machinery of control 1800-1914. The 19th century marked the zenith of British imperial power. With Napoleon defeated and the Industrial Revolution in full force, Britain turned its technological edge into global leverage. Steamships, railways, and the telegraph gave the empire unprecedented reach and speed. London became the beating heart of the world economy, and Queen Victoria its symbolic empress. Under her reign, the British flag flew over a quarter of the Earth's landmass, encompassing nearly a quarter of its population. The phrase, "the sun never sets on the British Empire," wasn't a metaphor, it was geography. In India, British governance became formalized after the 1857 Sepoy Rebellion, a brutal uprising triggered by cultural insensitivity and decades of resentment. The British Crown dissolved the East India Company and took direct control. What followed was a mix of infrastructure development and relentless suppression. Railways, canals, and schools were built, but always in service of extraction. The Indian economy was restructured to benefit Britain, and famine swept the countryside as cash crops replaced food production. British rule portrayed itself as civilized, but for many it meant starvation and humiliation. In Africa, the scramble was violent and fast. At the Berlin Conference of 1884-85, European powers, including Britain, carved up the continent like a pie without a single African at the table. Britain seized territories from Egypt to South Africa, enforcing rule with military expeditions and missionary zeal. The Zulu and Boer Wars revealed the brutality beneath the empire's polished surface. Concentration camps, scorched earth policies, and racial hierarchies were not exceptions. They were systemic tools of control. Britain portrayed itself as a civilizing force. But for millions, empire meant forced labor, land theft, and cultural erasure. As the 20th century approached, the empire had become a paradox. It exported Enlightenment ideals, liberty, law, democracy, while practicing repression, censorship, and apartheid. It built universities and railways, but only for the benefit of a colonial elite. From Ireland to India, unrest simmered. And as new ideologies emerged, nationalism, socialism, anti-colonialism, the empire's grip began to loosen. The seeds of rebellion had already been sown. The machine behind the empire, trade, navy, and ruthless bureaucracy, what truly sustained the British Empire wasn't just its military might, it was an intricate, interlocking system of power that spanned oceans and generations. At the center of it all was trade. The empire functioned like a vast commercial engine. Raw materials were extracted from colonies, manufactured into goods in British factories, and sold back to the same colonies or exported worldwide. This mercantile loop generated unimaginable wealth, but only for a few. While aristocrats in London drank tea imported from India and sweetened it with Caribbean sugar, those who harvested them often lived in chains. The British Navy was the empire's iron spine. It wasn't just a military force, it was a global police, ensuring shipping routes stayed open and colonies remained obedient. Naval superiority allowed Britain to blockade rivals, crush rebellions from the sea, and transport troops to any part of the empire within weeks. No rebellion could go unchecked when warships could appear on any coastline with cannons ready. The empire's reach wasn't just symbolic. It was enforceable within days, sometimes hours. But empires aren't just built on ships, they're built on paperwork. The British colonial bureaucracy was a marvel of organization and cold efficiency. From the Indian civil service to the administrators in Lagos or Hong Kong, a network of officials enforced British rule with a combination of legal manipulation, surveillance, and psychological domination. They created entire legal systems in English, disenfranchising locals who couldn't even read them. They taught history rewritten from the imperial perspective. Control wasn't just external, it was internal, linguistic, and generational. Economic control was cemented through banks, trade laws, and currency manipulation. The pound sterling became a global standard, and British banks operated across continents. British insurance companies, shipping firms, and investment houses dictated the flow of capital from Buenos Aires to Bombay. This financial empire was arguably more powerful than its military one. It didn't require bullets, only signatures. And in this system, independence movements struggled to breathe. Education and religion were used strategically. The British built schools that taught loyalty to the crown and introduced Christian doctrine, undermining local belief systems. Colonial subjects were groomed not just to obey, but to believe in the superiority of British civilization. The most effective empires, after all, are those whose subjects help build them. And by the late 19th century, millions across the globe were doing just that, knowingly or not. The secrets they never told you about the British Empire. Not everything about the British Empire made it into your schoolbooks. One of the most astonishing secrets is how much of its expansion was driven not by kings or parliaments but by corporations. The East India Company, a private business, once controlled more territory and people than most modern countries. With its own army, navy, and even coinage, it acted like a state within a state. And it wasn't just India. The company's fingerprints are found across Asia and Africa, reshaping entire economies and crushing resistance, all in the name of profit. The British Empire didn't just conquer lands, it rewrote their pasts. In Africa, ancient kingdoms were erased from maps. In Australia, entire cultures were deemed primitive and left unrecorded. The empire controlled narratives, presenting itself as a civilizing force while concealing genocides, massacres, and engineered famines. In Bengal, a British-enforced grain policy led to a famine that killed millions, yet the empire blamed nature, not policy. These truths, inconvenient and brutal, are only now being fully confronted. Did you know that tea, the symbol of British identity, wasn't British at all? It was stolen. The British smuggled tea plants from China to India to break China's monopoly, triggering the Opium Wars. Britain flooded China with opium, igniting a national crisis, just to balance trade. When China resisted, British gunboats arrived. It was one of history's most profitable and devastating narcotic operations backed by empire, waged for profit. The British Empire also experimented with surveillance and control in ways eerily familiar today. Fingerprinting, ID systems, racial classification, and mass censorship all have roots in colonial administration. British-run intelligence networks monitored speech, religion, and resistance across continents. The empire may be gone, but its tools remain, adopted by modern governments worldwide. The age of digital surveillance, some argue, was born in the jungles of Burma and the streets of Delhi. Perhaps most ironically, the same empire that preached liberty and parliamentary rule abroad actively suppressed democracy in its colonies. Indians, Africans, Caribbeans, millions were ruled without representation. Nationalist leaders were jailed, newspapers banned, elections rigged. The empire championed democracy at home while crushing it abroad. The contradiction was blatant, but effective. Few questioned it until it was too late. How the British Empire still shapes the world today. The sun may have set on the British Empire, but its shadow stretches far across the modern world. Nearly 60 countries are still part of the Commonwealth, A political and cultural legacy that maintains British influence in diplomacy, trade, and sports. English is now the most spoken second language on Earth, not because of coincidence, but because of imperial education systems that once aimed to mold colonial subjects in the image of their rulers. Global financial hubs like Hong Kong and Singapore owe their origins to British colonialism. These cities, once imperial outposts, became magnets of capital, trade, and globalization. The banking systems they adopted, the legal codes they follow, and even the way their ports operate are remnants of the British blueprint. Even in their independence, they carry the empire's DNA. Borders drawn by British administrators now define conflict zones across Africa and the Middle East. From the Sykes-Picot Agreement that carved up the Ottoman Empire, to the hasty decolonization of India and Pakistan, the British Empire redrew maps with rulers and ink often without regard for ethnic, tribal, or religious divisions. The result? Decades of war, instability, and identity crises that persist to this day. Modern parliamentary systems in former colonies like India, Canada, and Australia mirror the British model but with unique adaptations. While this legacy provided institutional stability for some, it also imported rigid class systems, centralized power structures, and colonial mentalities that still shape governance and social inequality. The imperial seed sprouted in different soils, but its roots remain deep. And then there's the psychological impact. Nations once colonized still wrestle with questions of cultural erasure, inferiority complexes, and identity reconstruction. Movements to remove colonial statues, rename cities, and reclaim indigenous traditions are all part of a long healing process. The empire's collapse did not erase its effects. It simply passed the burden of reckoning to the generations that followed. The British Empire no longer flies its Union Jack over distant lands, but its legacy is engraved in the DNA of the modern world. It exists in the languages we speak, the borders we defend, the systems we govern by, and the silent griefs of cultures that were once erased in the name of progress. It is both a monument to ambition and a graveyard of consequence. History rarely speaks in absolutes. Was the empire a force of civilization or domination, a bringer of law or theft? The truth, as always, lies somewhere in the tension between power and principle. But one thing is certain, no empire conquers a quarter of the earth and disappears, without leaving fingerprints on every surface. So when we speak of the British Empire, we are not just telling the story of the past, we are navigating the present, and perhaps glimpsing the future. A future where echoes of that empire still whisper, not in commands, but in questions we've yet to fully answer.